When I entered the courtroom in full uniform, Dad let out a quiet laugh, and Mom just sighed. The judge froze mid-sentence, his voice breaking as he said, "Dear God, it is really her." Silence filled the room. They never imagined who I had become. My boots clicked against the marble with a surgical precision that felt alien to them. Elias sat at the defense table, his tailored suit suddenly looking cheap against my medals. He did not know that the sister he mocked was his executioner. The air in the gallery felt thick with the scent of old paper and suppressed panic. My father leaned forward, his face a mask of confusion and rising anger. He still saw a little girl playing dress-up in her room. He did not see the captain who had dismantled 3 international smuggling rings. My mother adjusted her pearls, her face a mask of practiced indifference, as if searching for a way to rewrite this scene. The judge continued to stare, his hands trembling over the file. Everything changed when the prosecutor called me to the stand as an expert witness. I did not look at my family as I passed their row. I felt the heat of my father's gaze, a silent demand for obedience that no longer held power over me. I placed my hand on the Bible, the leather cool and worn under my palm. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting for the first blow. My oath was a physical weight, heavier than the gold on my shoulders. Captain Bethany Ward. "Please state your current assignment for the record," the prosecutor said. I looked directly at the judge, my voice steady and cold. I explained my role within the Black Sigil Integrity Unit. Elias flinched at the name, his smugness evaporating into a pale, thin sweat. He finally realized that the classified work I mentioned at dinner was not a joke. I began detailing the fraudulent invoices, each number a nail in his coffin. The room grew colder with every word. The defense lawyer tried to object, his voice high and desperate. He called my testimony a family vendetta, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. I produced the encrypted logs that Elias thought he had deleted. The digital fingerprints were unmistakable and carried my official seal of verification. My father's jaw dropped as the sheer scale of the betrayal became clear. He was not mourning the crime, but the sudden collapse of his perfect legacy. The truth was finally undeniable. As I finished my testimony, I turned to look at my brother one last time. He looked small, a shadow of the man who had laughed at my career just weeks ago. My mother was weeping silently, her face buried in a silk handkerchief. I stepped down from the stand with my head held high. My father tried to catch my eye, but I looked right through him. I had fulfilled my duty to the uniform and the law. For the first time, the silence was mine. The gavel hit the wood with a finality that shook the floor. Guards moved toward Elias as the judge declared a recess. My brother did not struggle. He sat frozen while the cold reality of a felony conviction settled over his narrow shoulders. I walked toward the rear exit, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the stone. The crowd parted like a dark sea. I could feel the heat of my father's stare burning into my back. I reached the heavy oak doors when a hand gripped my elbow. It was Sila's. His face was a map of broken veins and pure, unadulterated fury. He did not care about the laws Elias had shattered. He only cared about the stain on the Ward family name. My mother stood 2 steps behind him, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. The hallway was silent. People watched the fall of a dynasty with hungry, curious eyes. "You have destroyed your own blood," Silas hissed, his voice a low vibration of rage. I stood my ground, refusing to pull away from his touch. I looked at the silver bars of my captain's rank on my shoulder, and then back at him. My father was a man who lived for optics. He could not understand a world where the truth was not a negotiable commodity. I saw the tremor in his hands. He was losing control of the room. "I saved the service, sir," I replied. My voice was a flat, clinical blade that cut through his anger. He recoiled as if I had struck him. To Silas, the army was a social club for the elite. To me, it was a sacred trust. He leaned in closer. The scent of expensive bourbon and tobacco clouding the space between us. He whispered a threat that would have broken me a year ago. He promised to erase my career. My mother finally spoke, her voice a fragile reed in the wind. She begged me to tell the judge there was a mistake in the data. She wanted me to lie for a man who had sold military secrets to the highest bidder. I looked at her tired eyes and realized she was already mourning a life that never existed. They were trapped in a cycle of denial. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a digital drive. "There is more in here, Dad," I said softly. His eyes widened as I held the small device between us. This was not just about Elias. The audit had uncovered the foundation of the family fortune. It was built on the same corruption I had just dismantled in the courtroom. Silas went pale, his bravado vanishing instantly. He realized I had not just caught his son. I had documented his own decades of quiet, professional malpractice. The realization shattered the last of his pride. He stepped back, his hand falling away from my arm. He looked at me and finally saw the officer I had become. I was no longer the daughter who needed his permission to exist. I was the one holding the keys to his cage. A siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy air. I turned and walked into the sunlight. My father was no longer a colonel. The sun hit the courthouse steps with a brutal, blinding glare. I ignored the reporters and headed toward my parked SUV. My goal was simply get the evidence drive to the secure vault at headquarters. I could feel the weight of the metal casing in my pocket. It felt like a ticking bomb. I reached for my door handle, but a black sedan swerved across the asphalt to block my path. Two men in suits emerged quickly. The taller man flashed a badge I did not recognize. He claimed they were with internal affairs, but their posture was aggressive and wrong. They demanded the drive, citing a new emergency directive from the Pentagon. I took a step back, my hand hovering near my service weapon. The air grew still as the crowd watched from a distance. These were not government agents. They were the private security contractors Elias had hired to protect his secrets. "You are out of your jurisdiction?" I said. My voice was steady despite the thudding in my chest. I scanned the area for an exit route, but they moved to flank me. The shorter one reached for his jacket, his eyes darting toward the digital drive in my hand. He offered a bribe that would have retired my entire family. It was a desperate move. They knew the data on that disk would dismantle their entire private empire. I hit the silent alarm on my watch. A low vibration signaled that the Black Sigil team was 3 minutes away. The taller man lost his patience and lunged forward. I pivoted, using his momentum to shove him against the hot metal of my car. He grunted as his head hit the glass. The second man froze, his hand visible inside his coat. He realized I was not just a counterintelligence officer. I was a trained combat veteran. A sudden realization struck me as I looked at the man's wrist. He wore a distinctive tattoo of a broken compass. It was the mark of the syndicate my father supposedly defeated 20 years ago. The power balance shifted instantly. These men were not working for Elias alone. They were working for the ghosts of my father's past. The betrayal went deeper than a simple fraud case. My family had been a front for the enemy. The screech of tires echoed through the parking lot. 2 armored trucks with government plates roared toward us, forcing the black sedan to retreat. My team had arrived just in time. Major Hale stepped out, his rifle lowered but ready. He looked at the bruised man on the ground, and then at me. I handed him the drive with a trembling hand. The immediate threat had passed, but the real war was just beginning to surface. Hale looked at the drive and then at the men we had detained. He whispered that the encryption on the files was already being attacked by an outside source. My own agency was compromised. I looked back at the courthouse where my parents were still hiding. The digital drive was a map to a much larger conspiracy. I realized my brother was just the distraction. The true architect of the fraud was still sitting in my father's house. Major Hale signaled the tactical team to secure the perimeter. I climbed into the rear of the command vehicle, my fingers numb from the adrenaline. My objective was to run a deep, trace diagnostic on the drive before the hackers bypassed the firewall. The screens glowed with amber light as the system began to crunch the data. We were moving at 60 miles per hour. The city lights blurred into long neon streaks through the reinforced ballistic glass. The primary obstacle appeared on the secondary monitor. A red alert flashed, indicating a proximity wipe command. Someone was trying to delete the files from a remote location using a high-level military override code. My breathing hitched. Only a few people in the entire chain of command possessed those specific credentials. I fought the keyboard, typing lines of code to isolate the drive from the external network. The pressure was mounting as the progress bar stalled. A mid-scene turn arrived when the trace finally pinged a physical location. The override signal was not coming from the Pentagon or the courthouse. It was broadcasting from a private server located in the basement of my childhood home. My heart sank into my stomach. It was the same room where my father used to host his secret poker games. I realized Silas had built a shadow network right under my nose for 2 long decades. The signal is persistent. Hale muttered, his eyes fixed on the map. I realized the power balance had shifted again. I was no longer hunting a lone fraudster or a few corrupt contractors. I was fighting an entrenched system that used my family name as its primary shield. I redirected the trace to map the entire financial web. The screen populated with names of generals and politicians. The conspiracy was far wider than a logistics scam. I felt a surge of cold clarity. Silas was not just a silent partner. He was the architect of the entire Broken Compass syndicate. Every medal on his chest was a lie bought, with someone else's silence. I saw a transfer of funds dated 10 years ago. It paid for my own tuition at the academy. My stomach twisted with the realization that my career was funded by the very poison I was trying to cure. The vehicle suddenly swerved as a massive explosion rocked the street ahead. A transport truck had been detonated to block the bridge. We were trapped in a kill zone between the fire and the harbor. Hale shouted orders into his radio, but the interference was total. He looked at me with a grim expression. The attackers were not trying to steal the drive anymore. They were trying to bury every witness under the burning steel. I grabbed my rifle and checked the chamber. Through the smoke, I saw a figure standing near the wreckage. It was my father, clad in his old field jacket. He was holding a remote detonator and a satellite phone. He did not look like a grieving parent. He looked like a man ready to burn the world to protect his throne. He waved once, a mocking gesture of farewell. The bridge supports began to groan under the heat. The bridge groaned as the secondary charges detonated beneath the asphalt. My objective was simple: reach the detonator before the entire structure collapsed into the black water. Hale provided cover fire, his rifle spitting brass into the smoky air. I sprinted toward the silhouette of my father, my boots slipping on patches of melted rubber. The heat from the transport truck was a physical wall. Every breath tasted like copper and jet fuel. Silas stood firm, watching my approach with a terrifying, hollow calm. The primary obstacle was the gap created by the first explosion. A jagged fissure of twisted rebar and fire separated us. Silas raised the satellite phone, his thumb hovering over the final command. He was not just blowing a bridge. He was triggering a wipe of the global logistics network to cover his tracks. The pressure was absolute. If he pressed that button, the evidence on my drive would become useless noise. I had to jump across the chasm or watch the truth die. I leaped across the burning gap, my fingers catching the jagged edge of the concrete. Pain flared in my shoulder as I pulled myself up. A mid-scene turn occurred when I saw the second figure behind Silas. It was Elias. His face bruised and his eyes wide with horror. He was not a willing accomplice in this final act. He was being held as a human shield. Silas had used his own son as a pawn one last time to ensure my hesitation. "Drop the drive, Bethany," Silas commanded. His voice was devoid of the warmth he once used at Sunday dinners. He held Elias by the collar, the detonator pressed against the boy's chest. I stood up slowly, my hands empty and visible. The power balance shifted as I realized Silas was truly insane. He was willing to murder his golden boy to protect the syndicate. I saw the fear in Elias's eyes. For the first time, my brother looked at me for salvation. I reached for my sidearm, but Silas tightened his grip on the detonator. He began a countdown that felt like a heartbeat. My mind raced through the tactical possibilities. I noticed a small red light blinking on the satellite phone in his other hand. It was not transmitting yet. He was waiting for a confirmation signal from an offshore source. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Silas was not the top of the pyramid. He was still taking orders from someone else. I threw a flashbang toward the rebar, the white light blinding Silas for a crucial second. I lunged forward, tackling Elias out of the line of fire. We rolled across the hot pavement as the detonator clattered away. I reached for the device, but Silas kicked it toward the edge of the bridge. It teetered on the brink of the abyss. He lunged for my throat with a combat knife. His movements were fast and lethal, honed by decades of shadow wars. We struggled near the edge, the wind whipping my hair into my eyes. I managed to disarm him, but the satellite phone began to beep. The confirmation signal had arrived. I looked at the screen and saw the caller ID. It was the judge from the morning's trial. The man who had acted shocked in court was the one pulling the strings. Silas laughed, a dry and brittle sound. The conspiracy went all the way to the bench. The bridge began to tilt. The bridge groaned again as a support beam snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. My objective shifted instantly to securing that satellite phone before the judge could finalize the purge. Silas lunged again, his face a mask of primal desperation. I parried his strike and threw an elbow that connected with his ribs. He didn't flinch. The heat from the fires below was making the air shimmer. I could see the phone sliding toward the jagged edge of the abyss. One more tilt would send the truth into the harbor. Silas grabbed a length of loose cable to whip at my face. I ducked, feeling the wind of the heavy wire pass inches over my head. The obstacle wasn't just my father's combat skill. It was the fact that the entire structure was sliding into the water. Every movement required a delicate balance on the slick, angled concrete. Elias was crawling toward the detonator, his fingers bloody and trembling. The pressure of the countdown was a physical weight. Silas laughed as he prepared for a final, lethal charge. He knew time was his ally. A mid-scene turn arrived when the satellite phone began to broadcast a live audio feed. It wasn't just a signal. It was the judge's voice, cold and impatient, demanding a status report on the wipe. I realized the phone was the only link to the judge's secure location. If I destroyed it, I would lose the architect of the entire conspiracy. I had to capture the signal alive. Silas saw my hesitation and used it. He tackled me hard, pinning my shoulders against the burning rebar. His eyes were completely devoid of any mercy. The heat was melting the soles of my tactical boots. I managed to wedge my knee between us and shove Silas back toward the chasm. He stumbled, his heels hanging over the empty air. The power balance shifted as Elias suddenly grabbed the satellite phone. My brother didn't run. He held the device up and looked at our father with a look of pure, heartbreaking clarity. Elias realized he was never the golden boy. He was just the fall guy. He looked at the screen and saw the judge's face blinking in a video call. "He was going to kill me, Dad," Elias whispered. Silas froze, his hands outstretched toward his son. The facade of the great patriarch finally crumbled into something pathetic. My brother pressed a button on the screen, initiating a reverse trace through my black sigil terminal. He was using the skills I thought he lacked to trap the man at the other end. The judge realized the connection was compromised. He began to scream orders into the void. Silas looked at the phone and then back at me. He saw his legacy dying in real time. I used the moment to sweep Silas's legs, sending him crashing onto the hot asphalt. I snatched the phone from Elias and confirmed the trace was active. Major Hale's voice crackled through my earpiece, confirming they had a lock on the judge's coordinates. We had the architect. I looked at Silas, who was now weeping silently. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a broken old man in a burnt jacket. I felt a surge of cold, professional relief. The data was safe. The truth was out. The countdown finally stopped. The bridge gave a final, massive lurch toward the sea. We had to move now or drown in the wreckage. I grabbed Elias by the harness and began to pull him toward the stable side of the chasm. Hale was lowering a rescue line from a hovering helicopter. The wind from the rotors whipped the smoke into a frenzied spiral. I looked back for Silas, but he was gone. He had crawled toward the edge, choosing the water over the shame of a trial. I didn't stop. I had to save the living. We reached the cable and hooked ourselves in just as the section collapsed. The roar of the falling concrete drowned out everything else. I watched the bridge vanish into the dark harbor from 100 feet in the air. Elias was shaking, his eyes fixed on the empty space where our father had stood. I held the satellite phone tight against my chest. The mission was accomplished, but the cost was etched into my brother's broken face. I looked at the screen one last time. The judge's feed was still active. The judge wasn't running. He was sitting in a high, backed chair, smiling at the camera. He held up a file with my name on it. I realized the reverse trace had been a trap within a trap. He hadn't just watched us. He had uploaded a virus into the Black Sigil mainframes through our own link. My entire department was being erased as we watched. The phone grew hot in my hand as the hardware began to melt. I looked down at the city. The lights were starting to go out. The helicopter swung wildly as the digital blackout hit the skyline below us. My primary objective was to sever the connection before the virus reached the tactical server. I fumbled with the melting satellite phone, the plastic casing burning my palms. Major Hale shouted into his dead headset, his face illuminated by the red emergency lights of the cabin. The city was sinking into darkness, block by block. We were losing the data and our navigation. The situation was spiraling toward a total systems failure. The primary obstacle was the hardware itself. The phone was fused to the port in my terminal, creating a bridge for the corruption. I grabbed a combat knife and began prying at the connector. Sparks showered my boots as the battery began to swell. If the link remained for 60 more seconds, the Black Sigil infrastructure would be a memory. I could feel the heat radiating through my gloves. The helicopter dipped toward the harbor. We were flying blind in a silent sky. A mid-scene turn arrived when the monitor on the terminal flickered back to life. It was not the judge this time. It was a secondary feed originating from within my own home. I saw my mother sitting in the basement office I had traced earlier. She was not crying or hiding. She was typing with a focused, mechanical speed that I had never seen from her. My mother was the fail-safe. She was the one actually fighting the judge's virus from the inside. "Bethany, I am locking the ports." My mother's voice, steady and sharp, crackled through the cabin speakers. I froze, my knife poised over the melting wires. She was using a legacy encryption key that Silas had hidden years ago. The power balance shifted instantly. The judge's smile on the screen turned into a snarl of confusion. He did not know about the third player. My mother was sacrificing her own digital identity to save mine. She was the shadow architect behind the Ward family name. The virus halted its advance. Trapped in a quarantine loop created by the house server, I finally ripped the phone from the terminal and threw it out the open door. It tumbled into the dark harbor like a falling star. The helicopter stabilized as the instruments flickered back to a pale green glow. I looked at the screen, watching my mother's silhouette. She was erasing everything, including the evidence of her own life. She was choosing my future over her survival. I realized then that the silence she lived in was a strategic choice. She had been the one keeping the wolves from the door for decades. Elias sat beside me, his eyes wide as he watched her work. He saw the mother he thought was weak becoming the most dangerous person in the room. She looked into the camera once. There was no warmth, only a cold, professional goodbye. The connection severed. The basement in my childhood home vanished from the map. We landed on the roof of the command center 10 minutes later. The air was cold and smelled of ozone. Major Hale stepped out first, his rifle low and ready. I followed him, my heart feeling like a lead weight. The blackout had ended, but the world felt fundamentally changed. The data drive in my pocket was the only thing left of the conspiracy. I had to deliver it to the Attorney General before the judge could move. The fight was shifting. The primary obstacle was now the legal wall. As we entered the building, we were met by a line of federal marshals. They were not here to help us. They were holding a warrant for my arrest. The judge had already filed a preemptive strike, accusing me of treason and evidence tampering. The pressure was suffocating. I stood in the hallway, surrounded by men with guns. I realized that the law was currently wearing the judge's uniform. I was trapped. A micro twist occurred when one marshal stepped forward and whispered,